Well, good morning, Matthew. Welcome to the Risky Scientist.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk to you because we're going to talk about energy, which is something that the uh, the other parties are not talking about. So I think I'm right to say that you're representing SDP, Social Democratic Party, on energy, and we're going to talk about a Green Party you released just a few weeks ago. Did I say Green Party or Green Paper?
Bit of a Freudian slip there.
Yeah, it is because I was thinking this Green Party is going to this Green Paper is going to upset the Green Party most, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. Right. So first of all, Matthew, why is Britain in an energy crisis?
Trace it back, I think we have to go to the Electricity Act of 1989. This was the act that ultimately privatized the what was until then a fairly successful state-run energy system run by the Central Electricity Generation Board, the CEGB. That had been pretty effective for the previous 30 years at growing generation capacity by 3% on average year on year, and also continually investing in the basics like the transmission and distribution infrastructure. The problem is that it's the entire system that we had until that point was predicated on the CEGB running 5 to 7 year demand forecasts, then building ahead of demand and then achieving that. And instead, when we transitioned from that to a privately run energy system, we took out the central component of planning, which had been present up until that point. And instead of then, it was moment to moment, year to year, quarter to quarter market forces, which at first wasn't catastrophic. In fact, at first in the 1990s, it seems like it was greatly successful. We had a so-called dash for gas, which replaced a lot of the coal capacity with nominally cheaper gas capacity, albeit at the expense of prematurely closing a lot of the coal supply chain in Britain. But the problem was that then in the 2000s, by removing the planning function of the energy system and taking it out of the political domain, it made it possible for political incentives and distortions to the market to be implemented, which in the long run proved pretty catastrophic. I'm talking here about the shift to intermittent renewables that began in the mid 2000s, at first through renewable obligation certificates, and then what evolved into the contracts for difference scheme. We increasingly imposed heftier and heftier policy and network costs to the point where ultimately, between 2005 and 2024, the cost of these non-wholesale components of electricity prices represented around 80% of price growth in that period. And that price growth in total between 2005 and 2024 came to around a 260% increase in real energy prices. So ultimately, what we did is we had to many more fixed costs were required to at first subsidize the renewable transition, but then increasingly to serve the role of demand management, because ultimately you don't really have much control over when supply happens in a system put out by intermittent renewables. The question of, what happens when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. And the answer, an attempt to basically suppress peak demand has crept up on us by stealth. Um, and now the substitute, we have restored a type of planning in recent years in the form of bodies like the National Energy System Operator, NESO, and they're projecting double down on demand management. I believe they're projecting a 50% reduction in quote unquote peak demand between now and 2050. So if I had to give a narrative, then the decoupling of the energy system from the national economic and strategic considerations with which it's necessarily coupled was ultimately allowed a disastrous political experiment on the privatized system for the distortions for um, renewables incentives and then demand management schemes. Ultimately, has caused an explosion in real energy costs.
So I think we've got three phases to our
Yes.
energy crisis in causal terms, right? We've got what I might call deplanning or decentralization or privatization of planning, as you put it in the green paper. I'd like to talk about more about this. You identify a period from the 1950s where central planning was very good for growing the supply of electricity and therefore, in turn, lowering the price. So we have a deplanning or decentralization of planning in the 1980s, 1990s. And then we have rationing, as you correctly identify it. The government's claim is that it is reducing demand or managing demand, but it's actually rationing how much consumer can consume. And then we've got the shift to renewables, where renewables are extremely costly and intermittent in their supply. Is that a fair summary of
Yes,
the chronology?
I would say if I had to be slightly pedantic, I'd say the abandonment of planning first, then actually the exact specificities of the privatization model, in particular, um, because a not insignificant amount, this is minuscule compared to the rationing ecosystem, was actually the approach to privatization we took, which was and this would be step two in our chronology, which would be the role taken by the price cap system that we had between 1990 and 2019 before we kind of gave up on the attempt at treating energy like a competitive market. Between then we had a price cap system that effectively leaked firm profitability with efficiency improvements, but that ultimately caused the way that the system functioned in practice meant that it didn't encourage asset base increase, but instead it encouraged efficiency improvements. The consequence of that was basically encouraging firms to run down their asset base quite considerably, and we saw capital formation considerably drop in things like transmission and generation infrastructure, and the rise of excessive gearing and borrowing, because ultimately a lot of firms realized that at the start of a price cap period set by Ofgem, the regulator, firms could basically they pretty much universally overestimated the period's interest rates. And so, as a result of the system, many firms strategically just borrowed lots of money and used it to fund share buybacks and dividend buybacks, etc. Um, and well, under the price cap scheme, um, so that was a flawed model. This doesn't contribute as a significant role as to the rise of renewables, but the rise of renewables and ultimately the rise of rationing are very intimately connected because ultimately, alongside renewables being more expensive, the rationing is necessary to make them operate ultimately at scale to support a national grid. So I would say the three-stage plan was the abandonment of planning, the specificities of a privatization model, and the rise of renewables, which necessarily begat a rationing regime.
Yeah, yeah. So let's clarify the planning part of this because the sort of centralized planning that you admire in the form of the central electricity generating board, that's very different to what I think of as the centralized planning that you've characterized as rationing. I mean, they're both types of centralized planning in my view, and even
Yes.
you could regard the distortion of the market by the national government towards renewables. That's a form of centralized planning. I mean, am I wrong about that sort of equation of the different forms?
Well, I think the key is to get to brass tacks about definitions here. Centralized planning, in my view, is a holistic calculation of the setting by a centralized body of a key economic input into economic life. I'm basically calculating how much this is needed for economic activity as broader. And I would define the CEGB's model definitely as an instance of central planning. But the model that we have under our current system is not so much because it doesn't consider the role of the input in broader economic life. It broadly considers it through a pretty simple, um, single variable, which is decarbonization. And as a result, we effectively are having too little supply to run our energy system, which necessitates a rationing regime post hoc, if that makes sense.
So, so just to clarify this, so the central planning that you admire is of essentially infrastructure. The central planning that we dislike is of pricing through price caps and through controls of demand, through rationing of demand, and the subsidization of particular forms of energy generation, notably renewables. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
I'd say so.
Yeah.
And I guess if we had to make a key distinction, it was one where, the central planning of 58, 57, 58 through to 1990 was characterized by the state centrally planning and providing the commodity in question, the energy and power. Whereas the current
Yeah.
system is defined through they recuse themselves from that and have to provide incentive structures for intermediaries to ultimately deliver on their political objectives, which are necessarily much, and their political objectives are not actually economy-wide considerations. They are more so, single variable political obsessions.
Yeah, because I think it's important to clarify how the British government is behaving in the energy market because the government could claim that it's a private market and it's not centrally planning anything, and yet helping your argument towards more central planning of electricity generation is that the government is kind of centrally planning renewables pricing, carbon capping as well as price capping. So it is already centrally planning, which sort of adds to the SDP's argument. I say your and the party's argument that there should be that the solution to the energy crisis is central planning.
I think a great intuition of our party is what we call the social market model, which is that the public and the private sector should play clearly delineated but complementary roles in society. Let one domain do its work and let the other domain do its work. And what we've seen over the last 40 or so years is the rise of the regulated markets in which the interests and the operational practices of two heavily overlap. And these are generally characterized by being very inefficient, by having inheriting the worst of both worlds of both the private and the public model. And I would say the energy system, as it stands, is a very good example of such a hyper-regulated market, which runs contrary to our social market ethos. Ultimately, the what we've seen over the last several decades is the rise of what you call so-called stakeholder capitalism, which is complex a lot of complex domains of economic activity where it's very difficult to make decisions because ultimately you've got you have these overlapping stakeholders in the public and private sector involved in an endeavor, which makes it very difficult to get things done. And I'd say the energy falls prey to this. It's almost impossible to do, actual central planning. And anything that passes close to it in this domain is ultimately just an attempt at basically pulling incentive levers, which which don't really have a clear correspondence with end results because of simply put, there's not really a person that is answerable in the chain of command.
What explain the rationale for where the justifications, I should say. What are the
Yeah.
justifications for the government intervening upstream, but leaving other parts of the system to the private sector?
Well, I think it's because in our position, ultimately, we are calling pretty full system nationalization. But our rationale for that comes down to, I think there's three big reasons. Firstly, large parts of the system are natural monopolies. Transmission and distribution, the actual pylons and cables. It doesn't really there's not really an incentive in a market system to duplicate that, which means that you have one provider and you have all the issues that come with natural monopolies. There's not really an incentive for continuous investments. Asset stripping is, one of the more profitable means to run it down. Just in time maintenance and servicing, etc. Which is the problem because one major quality of the energy system is continuity of energy supplied. So service interruption could be very destructive. The second is the energy system, particularly because of the fact that there's three phases. There's the generation, the power plant, there's the transmission and distribution, and then there's the actual metering and payment by customers. Because of the nature of the structure, there's a big problem with information asymmetry that arises. Electrons aren't branded. An electron that comes out of one power plant doesn't come with produced by company X and then isn't meets the consumer. Ultimately, what the way the system has to operate is through a reseller model, i.e., an end supplier, whether that be tied with a generation firm or whether it be a pure play independent reseller, basically, buys bulk um, bulk power provision from a generator, pays the network fees to the network and transmission operator, and then uses that to calculate a price per kilowatt hour on the electricity side and resells to the consumer. This gives rise to extremely complex wholesale energy markets, which have a lot of opportunity, and we've seen it historically for um, for ultimately for hidden charges, arbitrary cost increases, and there's, I believe, these wholesale electricity markets are so complex that there's an order of only probably a few hundred to 1,000 people max in the country that actually understand a fraction of it in practice, which isn't a great position for consumers to be in. And this is probably one of the things that guided Ofgem in 2019 to abandon the pretense of market competition in the space and basically basically set the price of electricity through a hard price cap of saying, this is what the price should be, and not what all resellers tended towards. But even then, that information asymmetry does exist, and it can get ugly. And then the final one is financing for generation. More power plants are expensive, and with each generation they get more expensive in absolute terms, but more efficient in providing their output per megawatt of capacity. As a result, financing costs become a much more significant part of the lifetime cost of a plant, which means they become much more sensitive to interest rates. And the cheapest source of credit typically in a market is government bonds. Um, and if those government bonds, as we typically see, enjoy, a several percentage point premium over private credits, that could potentially well more than half the lifetime cost of a plant compared to financing on the private market. Uh, and so ultimately, actually, it makes lifetime economic sense to do so because otherwise it does. There's a big opportunity for wealth transfer between the public and creditors. So those are the big three overarching rationales for why states should be intimately involved in planning of generation, transmission, distribution, and and involved deeply in the supply side. Now, I think you could probably. I think there might be room. There might be room for some private involvement at the extreme ends um, of generation for this one. I think I think private generators, an enterprise here could work in the context of the state basically setting out a contract for a private provider to provide X power, X costs. But that would basically be an exercise in central planning still, just with private actors, getting involved to provide a competitive offering that meets the needs of the plan.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, so let's just close out the discussion of the causes of the energy crisis. So you set out some what I would think of as necessary causes to the crisis, such as the abandonment of centralized planning and then price caps, renewals. They're all necessary. It seems when you present the data for when and how quickly British electricity prices rise, it seems to become exponential in the
Yes.
2000s or at least the 2010s. So it's not a typical exponential curve, but the 2010s. So does that suggest? I mean, it suggests to me. I know there are lag effects in how causes cannot sometimes are not seen until decades later um, as they work into the system. But it seems to me that the trend to renewables is the greater accelerant to the rise in prices.
Hmm. I would say you're absolutely correct there. Because we characterize it in three phases. Firstly, between '04 and '09, real prices grew by 98.8%. Then between 2010 and 2017, relatively slow growth of 10.7%, and then it took off again after 2018, between 2018 and 2014 at 78.2% real price growth. And we can see that roughly reflected in terms of the contribution of renewables to the grid in both periods. In '04 to '09, they were pretty insignificant in terms of their grid contribution, but you could see that that was when the renewable obligation certificate scheme began to really kick off, and that was an effect of basically tacking on some pretty significant um pretty significant costs onto retail energy bills to fund this and projects and guide them towards commercialization. You saw gradual, and I would say probably the lag. They grew pretty continuously and steadily between 2010 and 2017, but that was almost a lag effect of the real price growth you saw in '04 and '09 and the subsidy regime you had there. But then you saw a significant acceleration in the trend after 2017, and a much more rapid contraction in and remaining coal capacity, and the squeezing out of gas. And that was when the system shifted, I believe, from being about let's encourage more clean renewables to actually trying to heavily decarbonize and eliminate hydrocarbons from the grid as a major policy objective. And I would say that was probably that probably characterizes the 2017 to 2024 price rises.
So we've seen an increase in energy prices of what?
In real terms, between 2004 and 2024, after adjusting for inflation, they went from 7.28 pence in 2004 to 26.4 pence in real terms in 2024. So that's a 260 odd% real terms increase.
Okay, so let's talk about the consequences for productivity. You got some interesting estimates of the cost to productivity just of more expensive electricity of expensive electricity. So explain that to us.
Before I get into our calculations, I think it's useful to almost think about the story that's going on there, which is ultimately, if you think of an economy like a massive body with blood pumping through the veins, etc., then it's grid electricity is almost like it is the animating force there. It is the blood. It is what ultimately enables work to literally be done. It's what enables process. It's behind for a lot of cases things like process heat. It's what enables machinery to move, etc. And so a restriction in supply is almost guaranteed to reduce productivity because it means literally less can be done. And I think it's very prosaic. And one of my favorite graphs in the paper is one on in the first pages, which just overlays the productivity index with electricity supplied in aggregate in terawatt hours, and you see us peak in terms of electricity supplied on our grid circa 2005, and then begin a steady but quite significant fall, and that's and that is almost tied exactly, I think, with a 1 year lag effect to Britain's post productivity stagnation from the 2000s onwards. And how is that manifested? Well, the obvious one is strangling energy intensive industries. I grew up not too far from the old Imperial Chemical Industries complex in Northern England, in the shadow of that, what was once, one of Europe's largest synthetic ammonia plant. The local football club is called Billingham Synthonia, from the old branding for the old plant. It's the chemical industry played a big part in the community. It's gone. It's especially over the last 5 years, it's gone. And that's not, and that's even, and that's just one of the more energy intensive industries: steel, cement making, gone, decamped. There's the margins for operating these just aren't there. But then even outside these more egregious instances of energy intensive industry shuttering, it deters in general the adoption of labor saving technology, because ultimately, in many cases, it just doesn't make sense, like the power bills to operate, a little robotic arm in a packing plant or something like that. Just don't make sense when energy prices aren't high. So what does this mean in numbers? This is one of those areas where I think the economic research is actually pretty young. because I think for because there was probably two camps of people that were doing this. One was the but was sort of was in the 1970s and 1980s. There was a camp of economists that were quite interested in um in biophysical inputs, the ecological economics, etc. That looked into this, but they never did any much in the way of hard mathematics. But recently, I think with energy prices becoming such an issue around the West, conventional economists have caught up in recent years, and this is where we get our projection. The OECD a couple of years ago did a very good working paper looking at energy prices for firms throughout Europe, and they established that every 5% rise in real energy prices reduces productivity by around 0.4% economy-wide in the following year as an initial projection. Um, Now, and so if you take that figure and if you apply that to the British real price trajectory, you get a pretty well, in aggregate since 2005, you get uh, productivity reduction of around 10.8%. High productivity right now is 10%, 10.8% lower had real prices not risen after 2005. And if you map that the trajectory of the productivity hikes onto annual GDP on gross value add, you find that in total the total cost is 3,070 billion, over 3 trillion. That's in terms of aggregate impact to output since 2005. That's over 1 year of current national output, or equivalent to the current national debt. And I think it's a structural explanation of so much of what is ultimately going wrong at the moment. It's quite a stark figure.
Yeah, the figures you present are absolutely shocking. I mean, as you say in the paper, electricity supply has fallen 26% since 2005. It seems so ridiculous when the government is claiming efficiencies from particularly renewables, and yet that one datum suggests to me, or it illustrates to me, the the flaw in that thinking, right? Flaw, FLAW, not
Yeah,
floor to the trends, FLOOR. That the problem, as we've alluded to earlier with renewables, is um, intermittent supply and low energy density. And you've got the total supply falling by a quarter in 20 years during this rush to renewables. I'm making up that phrase. There was a rush to gas, and then in the 90s, and then a rush to renewables in the 2000s, 2010s. I mean, it's just 26% decline in supply. How on earth, given that renewables are so much more expensive than as generators than other forms, how on earth did anybody expect uh, that we would not see an exponential rise in pricing?
the one thing I have to give credit to is that actually the industry, and the wider economy has managed to absorb this shock with only, a stagnation in productivity rather than an outright collapse. Um, that's a credit to lots of innovations and lots of improvements in energy efficiency across the board, which means that hopefully once the situation is rectified, that will mean that the return to normalcy will see quite a nice, like we'll see hopefully a very very nice economic would see a very nice economic boom. Put fingers very tightly crossed, of course. But yeah, when you cut your supply by over a quarter for an input into the economy, of course the price is going to rise by such an insane amount, and I think the problem is again the by abandoning the planning function of the state in energy, the state was able to indulge itself and think, oh, the system could sort it out in some way, but the system couldn't sort it out, and ultimately the system of policy and network costs that evolved to plug the gap, which constitute now the majority of our bills, are ultimately the means to prevent the system from failing. They are the only way that we can basically prevent demand from overwhelming this much more limited supply. They didn't. They weren't. I truly believe they were. There's a level of naivety to it where I believe many people in the civil service and in Ofgem don't realize that actually they've created a system where the incredible price rationing measures that they devolve to be, they don't actually see them that way. They do actually just see them as, as basically means to encourage, purely to encourage renewables. But they are ultimately, right now, they are load bearing. If we were to pull them up, if we were basically, do as I know Reform have touted a few times, simply like going after air and peeling them off instantly, the grid would collapse. The grid would collapse because supply is so much lower than what organic demand is at the moment.
I think there was a lot of wishful thinking in the 90s and the 2000s, particularly under the Blair administration. There was a lot of vagaries about vague promises about how efficient renewables would actually be, that the prices would go down. I mean, I don't know if you recall the Blair administration promising that we would be greener and prices would go down. And I think that was wishful. I appreciate your point um, that there was some naivety that you could excuse some naivety that where you know the civil servants did not understand how carbon intensive renewable production is, ironically, and how expensive the capital costs and how low the return is on renewables, unless they're being subsidized, right, which covers up the true cost. I mean, there was some naivety, but I think there's some wishful thinking. I mean, uh, the 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 politicians back in the 2000s, I don't think were willing to engage with the fossil fuel industry. I mean,
No.
the lobbying was extremely biased. There was an availability bias to lobbying from renewables, which was just not as empirical as the lobbying from the fossil fuel industry.
Oh, and you can see that now. I mean, if you look at Mr. Dale Vince of Ecotricity, who's one of the big, people that have the government's ear on this, I'm afraid I do try and be polite on these things, but I think the man's arguments are no better than that of a dullard sixth former. They're very weak. They're very weak, and and the standard of debate on this domain is extremely poor. Ultimately, the person that seems to win out most in the room when on these meetings, whether it be a select committee, whether it be a backroom meeting, is the person that moralistically cries decarbonisation the most, not the person that asks the more difficult questions about about balancing the books almost.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, let's put some data together. So, at one point in your green paper, you make this point that you are estimating that lost productivity cost Britain
Three
more than three
thousand
trillion.
three
Yeah,
thousand and
three
seventy
trillion.
billion. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, over 20 years. That's equivalent to 146 billion per year, which is then in turn equivalent to what the government is currently borrowing. It's slightly less than what the current government, Starmer's administration, is actually borrowing
Yeah.
to fill its budget deficit. And just to be clear, the 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 lost productivity wouldn't have eliminated that budget deficit unless the government were to tax 100% of the value of that productivity. We're just making an equivalency for the
Yeah.
purposes of scaling. It wouldn't solve the current debt crisis, but it would certainly help. There are lost revenues from lost productivity. Now, during that same period, you've got this other interesting data. In 2003, 92% of energy capacity was oil, coal, gas, or nuclear. And in 2023, it was just 44%. So most of our energy production during the period where energy prices, electricity prices, I should say, exploded was the period when we shared about 50% of our, nearly 50% of our oil, coal, gas, and nuclear capacity.
Yes. And that's because ultimately, because oh, the disingenuous trick that we're often played, that's often played to us, is that we're given the nominal install capacity of these renewable sources, which has, and if you were to look at that, then renewables in install capacity terms make up at well over half of our grid. But you have to account for the intermittent nature of them. And to do this is a process called derating. You basically, take the capacity factor, which is the amount of time in which of the year they were able to operate, and then, derate them down. Now, hydrocarbons and fossil fuels, they also have capacity factors, but you can control when that capacity factor is applicable. That's the utilization rate of a given plant. The capacity factor for renewable is outside of our control. So ultimately, that's the entire fleet of renewables. So you basically do have to, whereas you can, with fossil fuel capacity, you can basically time plant maintenance, plant shutdowns, refueling cycles to overlap with one another, to make sure you're continually covered. You can't do the same with intermittent renewables, which means that in practice, you have to discount the entire output of the fleet to reflect that, which means that ultimately, while nominally making up around half of our installed capacity, in practice, the contribution to the grid by intermittent renewables, in terms of actual energy that's supplied by people to be consumed, is only around 25%. It's around half as effective as the fossil fuel capacity. So basically, it's a much less effective source of providing energy that we need, and which ultimately is what the big thing, which is while the line's gone down on the fossil fuel capacity, um, we've tried to just do a system of one-to-one substitution with that with intermittent renewables, which can provide half as much energy in real terms.
Yeah, yeah, and to be clear, I mean, we don't want this video to appear as an attack on renewables. In theory, renewables are the right way to go. One of the problems that with renewables that isn't in the paper is that production of the actual plant that generates energy from renewable sources, they are more energy intensive to build than they will ever return in their life cycles. This is a point that I don't think the public is fully aware of. So when because the audience could be thinking, well, I realize renewables are driving up cost, but they're good for reducing the consumption of fossil fuels. Well, no, they're not, because the energy and even the materials that go into the physical plant for you to be able to generate electricity from renewables uses fossil fuels, right? So I mean, even the virtuous justifications for renewables fall apart. So, because we're making a
Yeah.
trade-off. Most of your green paper is rightly focused on a trade-off between the desire to lower fossil fuel consumption and then emissions of toxic gases and contributing that some of which contribute to climate change. That's a good intention. But renewables, so some of the audience could be saying, well, we are reducing fossil fuel consumption, we're reducing greenhouse gases, therefore we should just suck up the cost. And in fact, a lot of lobbyists like Just Stop Oil, they make that argument, just suck it up. The cost that the consumer pays is a reflection of the cost to the planet.
Yes.
But they're ignoring the fact that renewables are not net efficient for our consumption of fossil fuels.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this is in the industry they call this the life cycle analysis paradigm. And if you look at the embedded emissions of whether it be the carbon fiber blades, the wind turbine, the generator system, the extraction and processing of critical minerals for the solar panels, yeah, it generally especially our latitude given for solar, it doesn't really work. And for wind turbines, the amount of foundation work that has to be done, and the concrete and steel required, for wind turbines does undermine greatly the carbon return on investment, if you want to label it that way. For wind, I think there are places in the world where it does make sense. Nevada, if I were to drive out to Nevada or Texas, for example, actually, I think it where the latitude where where much closer where you're much closer to the equator, it can work out quite nicely. You can get quite a good return. Problem is that Britain is one of the highest latitude economies in the world. Actually, just not don't even need to qualify that. Just one of the highest latitude economies in the world. That means that solar is uniquely weak in our context, which means that you are pretty much solely reliant on wind patterns. And once you're putting it all on you're putting everything in the bag of wind patterns, it's very difficult for that to be of a grid scale utility. Actually, and I think actually there's a lot of good case to be made for use of wind and solar in microgrids, and especially in Britain's case in wind specifically for specific individual plants and industrial parks. If you get some storage infrastructure up and you get some wind turbines, and you basically store the power for use down the line for a particular industrial process. That makes sense. But for a national grid, not so much.
So let's talk about something that is in your green paper. I don't think we've mentioned it yet. So you mentioned why renewables make more sense in a state like Texas or Arizona. So we are closer to the equator. We have more sunshine, and there are places on the plains or the mesas where the wind is very strong. So you can have enormous wind farms as well as solar farms. You've got wind and sun. The other thing we haven't mentioned is that land is cheap in
Yes.
Nevada and Arizona and Texas, where these enormous wind and solar farms are put down. Britain doesn't have cheap land. Now you've got some data in the green paper where you say, so you explain the power density problem, and I'll let you expand on this. So solar requires a lot of land. That requires 40 times more land than an equivalent natural gas plant. And then an offshore wind farm will require 90% more land, and an onshore wind farm will require 230 times more land than an equivalent natural gas plant. Now, these data really strike home to me, and I think they would to the audience, why renewables are particularly difficult choices for Britain. Our land is expensive, and it's not just the expense of the land. There are social costs to building these things over great areas of land, such as the spoiling of the landscape, where
Hmm.
you've got national parks that are effectively spoiled by enormous wind turbines, and that's sort of a national asset which is spoiled. But then private homeowners complain that their view is spoiled without any consultation with them. A wind turbine, they've bought a property perhaps on a hill or on a Yorkshire dale with a beautiful view, and then without consultation with them, somebody develops wind turbines in that view. And wind turbines, I'm sorry, I don't know, I don't care how enamored you are with renewables, and I am partly enamored with them, but for the micro scheme that you just mentioned, which we'll get into, I don't care how enamored you are with renewables, you cannot claim that wind turbines are good for the landscape.
Well, I think it's for these reasons that ultimately Britain's mostly pivoted. Solar, we've seen a renewed push in solar in recent years, but I believe that is primarily because of capturing the subsidy largesse of government schemes rather than actual logic. The only really real logic for construction of renewables, and the only real serious capital that goes towards it is offshore wind. And that's the name of the game. And offshore wind, it does nominally it's the strongest performer. Um, problem of them all. But the problem is that as you've hinted, the carbon return on investment is pretty poor because they even need even more foundation work than onshore wind farms because you've the and they need and the material side of things they depreciate very rapidly. It's you if you get more than 15 years out of a wind farm site, you are extremely fortunate. Um, Simply because the amount of winds that are battering those things are incredible. Um, yeah, and even that land, even if it looks like the foundation work, you need a lot of you need land clearance, you need surveying, you need basically to have a fleet of service boats constantly servicing them. You need to lay down many miles of cabling and transmission substations underwater. Um, it's incredible for the energy you get. It's incredibly capital intensive. It's not, and yeah, and generally that's why I think I don't I believe onshore and solar developments that they're trying to push those through, but they're a token gesture at best at the moment because these no investors are really wanting to throw their money at schemes like this that they know are going to probably be locked up in planning disputes and local disputes for years before anything gets on the ground.
Yeah, and there are environmental costs with offshore wind, which are peculiar to offshore wind. So, I mean, essentially, the spoiling of a landscape is an environmental cost as well as a social
Yes.
cost. You're sinking concrete into the ground, and then you're spoiling the view. In offshore wind, you've got the actual drilling, the pile driving, the pouring of the concrete that has that damages marine life, not just around the actual production area, but far away in the form of noise pollution, which drives away marine life. Right, so the British part of my audience may not be aware that in America, on the east coast of America, the construction of offshore wind turbines has been linked with the deaths of large marine mammals, so whales, dolphins, particularly that wash up on shore, local to where this production, local in time and space to where these turbines are being produced. And there are actually some states that impose moratoria on further production to try to at least study and confirm this is what's happening. And I hear that there is at least anecdotally the same link, causal link, to be evidenced with marine life washing up on British shores too. And the other problem with offshore wind that we haven't mentioned is that it disrupts maritime traffic.
Mm.
It is when it's close to shore, you are still spoiling the landscape. People go to the beach and they look out into what should be the open ocean, and they see wind turbines. And you're also disrupting pleasure maritime traffic. So pleasure boats cannot operate freely around these turbines. And of course, the big maritime transportation canal, the stuff that is useful to our imports and exports cannot operate. And Britain has a lot of coastline, but it is quite restrictive coastline because of depths and competing international claims on those waters, the territoriality of those waters. So the maritime passageways around Britain are actually quite restrictive, and you're making them more restrictive by planning enormous offshore wind farms in those waters.
Yes, no, and it's a good point. If you ever bring up on those charts of shipping lanes, I mean it's always the English Channel that's the brightest red of them all, and the North Sea too. And from a pilotage perspective, of course, restricting that room for maneuver, it is a massive bottleneck on shipping. Both British shipping and also shipping from the Baltics and Northern Europe that wants to that wants to pass through the North Sea. It's it's quite it's very restrictive.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Right. So let's get on to some solutions. Let's talk about the solutions that are in the paper.
Of course. Well, so the big takeaway from us is a 10-year plan to stabilize the energy system and ultimately build in rapid short form the generation capacity. Um, there are issues of transmission and distribution, but ultimately the structural problem is the generation shortfall, that 26.7% reduction in joules supplied via the grid. And what we calculate is that roughly the supply gap, i.e., the gap between the counterfactual world where we hadn't embarked on this restriction in supply post 2004 5, and today comes up at around 30 gigawatts of capacity. But there you also have the fact that the dash for gas of the 1990s meant that most natural gas plants are very temporarily concentrated. So we've got over 20 gigawatts or so of capacity that's set to shatter in the next decade or so, and also 5 gigawatts worth of nuclear plants that are set to shatter, and the Drax and Lima biomass plants. Roughly, that means that 60 gigawatts of capacity are needed pronto in the next decade to basically bring to as a short term as a means to basically rectify the energy system to its its 2005 state. Um, to do that, we proposed 40 gigawatts of new natural gas capacity and 20 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity. The 4 gigawatts of gas is probably the least controversial part of it, given that we are relatively that's where that's the latest generation of fossil fuel capacity that we enjoy. We've got generally good pricing for new plants on a cost approximation front, etc. And there's a rich ecosystem of providers of capacity. Um, so roughly, so for that one, we're roughly costing around 500 million per gigawatt of the gas capacity as a starter. However, which will bring it up to 20 billion or so. Um, then for the coal, that's the more controversial component, of course. The reason why is ultimately in the long term, coal has a much better uh, cost on a per joule basis. If you look at the per joule cost of gas versus coal, I think coal comes up around $2.5 or so per gigajoule, whereas natural gas comes up at around 3.2 dollars per gigajoule, which means that over the long term you can see some quite significant savings in costs from coal, even though the capital intensity of the plants themselves are significantly higher. Um, and it's on and in addition, it's simply the case of providing a little bit more diversification in the in the feedstock for the energy mix, because ultimately reliance on one fossil fuel category for the energy system we don't think is too wise from a energy security point of view. And from this perspective, we're costing the coal capacity at around um, let's see, I believe we two, two, £2 billion per gigawatt. That was it. So that would be 40 billion upfront. So we're and if we throw it, if we were to price it all up a bit, an upper ceiling, we believe the 60 gigawatts of grid stabilization at the upper bound, if we were to add a 50% margin to all of our costs for the capacity, would cost around 100 billion. We have an ideal means to finance this too, however, rather than new debt or borrowing in of itself, because right now the reason why it's very difficult to build this, why why there's not much in the way of new private construction, um, independently of the state of new fossil fuel capacity, is the 2008 Climate Change Act. Um, and the Climate Change Act ultimately mandates that decarbonisation should be baked in as a government imperative, etc. And as part of that as well, it also has mandated net zero investments in energy transmission infrastructure to basically help in the rationing of energy and the real-time coordination of intermittent demand, intermittent supply, and national demand better. But these costs are averaging throughout the 2030s around £10 billion a year, at least. 20 billion on on an upper bound in some years. So by repealing the 2008 Climate Change Act, you do free up quite a lot of earmarked spending for the 2030s. That could be used to finance this up to £100 billion in new plant. So that would be the first phase of our energy system um, fix. Um, I guess I might leave a pause there for any questions on that one because that's I know it's phase one, but I imagine there's a lot of
Yeah,
questions
yeah.
that might come
So
up there.
so I did have a question on that. So why do you think so? This is not in the paper. You may have just not had space for it, but why do we need coal to stabilize the grid? If you're going to repeal the Climate Change Act, couldn't you also liberalize the permitting of drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea? Could that not generate a sufficient rise in production of British oil and gas that you wouldn't need the coal?
This is pretty thin, and I do believe that ultimately, in the medium to long term, absolutely, I think that the it's almost been possible to report the data because ultimately, like the licensing and approval pipeline is so constrained by fiat from the state at the moment. But yeah, there's very good odds that we have enough domestic reserves of oil and gas to cover the full scope of demand. However, generally, just on it is that per gigajoule cost of coal on an energy basis that makes it much more appealing in the medium to long term. We For a nice, solid, consistent base of the energy supply system, the the energy system. The issue is oil and gas have many uses. They're much easier to transport, they're much easier to store. That means that they're foundation for most transport fuels, for most industrial processes. Coal, with the death of steam railways and that sort of stuff, it's pretty much used for coking steel and a few industrial processes and firing up power grids. That means that reduced utility means that there's significantly less demand for it as an input compared to oil and gas worldwide, which means that almost by necessity, it's going to be somewhat cheaper to run an energy system. Use coal as a plank for your energy system. Um, this and ultimately, I believe at first any new coal would require we'd be heavily dependent on Australian and Indonesian imports. However, we do have some of the more on a per capita basis. Britain does have some of the most significant hard coal anthracite coal reserves in the world, which is the really high quality coal that's very pure carbon, little in the way of impurities, unlike say what you mine in Germany or continental Europe. Um, which is very much primed for use in metallurgical processes and power generation, etc. And from my point of view, I think providing a good source of demand for the resurrection of British coal production, which was killed prematurely, I believe, through in the dash for gas in the 1990s, would be of great industrial value for the country because ultimately, alongside serving as a core for a couple of decades for power inputs, I believe there's a long-term value for use of coal as an industrial input in things like liquefaction. One area that I'm always fascinated by is, and one of the few economies that did this was South Africa. It was an attempt by them to escape apartheid era um, trade embargoes, which is using when applying heat and pressure to coal to liquefy it into oil and gas. So you have synthetic oil and gas production that basically, significantly uplifts the value of a given quantity of coal by 50 odd percent. Um, and that could be and I believe that in the medium to long term, that could be a very strong export market for the country. But you do ultimately need a domestic source of demand to really bootstrap mining and production again.
Yeah, so well, let's clarify this. I don't think it's in the paper, but how long do you think Britain would be using coal for electricity generation? Because you're not talking about a temporary but by the sounds of what you're saying verbally there, it doesn't seem like you could argue to a skeptical vote electorate that we just need cheap coal for a few years before
Yeah.
we get on stream enough oil and gas to replace that goal. You're talking about longer than a decade of using coal for electricity generation, is that right?
Yeah, so the life cycle of a new coal plant is around 40 years. And I would like for these new plants to be used for like to have full life this generation in our grid stabilization program to have a full lifetime time of use. So I would say probably 40 years of further coal use. My hope then would be by then we could fully nuclearize baseload and baseload generation. Um, and like, there probably wouldn't be a need for a further generation of coal plants. But that 40-year period would be enough to bootstrap British coal extraction and British coal production to ultimately achieve the level of productivity required to be competitive globally and thus be used as a feedstock for those industrial processes I was hinting at.
Right, I got you. Thank you, Matthew, for clarifying that. Very few parties would clarify time periods into the future. So you can see the the problem with the reaction to that, where you're talking about 40 years of use of coal. That's going to take us to 2065. Net zero has a 2050 um, threshold on it. you know, strap in, Britain. You've got to persuade Britons to accept a what would you call it? A reintroduction of coal. Is that the right one?
Yeah,
or
I mean, ultimately, and we do hint at this in one of our discussions. Emissions reduction in of itself is not the route that Britain can play for the. Let's, um, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, um, it generally it's a good idea to to minimize our global anthropogenic greenhouse gas production. It makes sense. It's a good common externality you want to reduce. Question is, how do you achieve that? Um, well, I think emissions reduction makes a lot of sense if you're China and you're India. It makes a lot of sense because ultimately, on a sheer population basis, that's a big lever you can pull. For Britain, which produces 0.8% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, um, it's not really a helpful lever. The helpful lever is largely through the technologies that would is for the development of the technologies that can be used to sequester, remove, and mitigate the impact of carbon dioxide. I'm a big fan of, I'm quite interested, for example, in technologies like geoengineering, the use of to artificially manipulate, to artificially reduce the amount of solar radiation hitting the surface of the planet, and thus, and thus directly offsetting the impact of rising carbon dioxide levels. I'm quite interested in carbon sequestration technology, the direct sucking of like direct air capture technology to suck carbon dioxide out of the air and use it maybe to, as a direct input for hydroponics and greenhouses and that sort of stuff, um, or as an input for other industrial processes. And I believe this is the domain that Britain actually is probably best placed to play, is to actually play in the not in the of it because of our production in the amount of input that we have, the amount of output per carbon is so low here. And it necessarily is because of the realities of population and location. Um, it's not the lever we can pull. The lever that we can pull is it is the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or the mitigation of the effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That I think that's the most important and impactful lever we can pull.
Yeah, right. It'd be much better for the planet because that sort of technology is distributable,
Yes.
whereas Britain's emissions are peculiar to Britain, right? So, but let me press you on how Britain's emissions would change under your plan, because I don't think it's in the paper, but you do have in the paper the 0.8% of global emissions. Britain is accounting for 0.8% of global emissions, which many people have pointed out makes the mania for net zero seem pretty ridiculous because Britain is going to suffer all the costs to make a trivial difference to global emissions, right? So can you scale how Britain's share of global emissions will change under your plan to reintroduce coal?
I holistically, the best way I could do it is probably by, and I'm going off of memory, I'm afraid, not anything in the paper, but the emissions per capita increase. And I believe we've achieved a 40 to 50% emissions per capita decrease since 2005. So I'd estimate roughly we'd be going up from 0.8% to 1.2% of global contributions, assuming all else worldwide has been equal.
Yeah, well, that's a good estimate, right? Because it's still, in the global scheme of things, it's trivial. Locally, if you're living near a coal plant, might not be so attractive, but globally, certainly, that's pretty trivial. All right, let's get on to nuclear, sir. Phase
Yeah,
two.
of course. Well, so the rationale for this is so phase one in the first phase of our 10-year plan is to stabilize us and bring us back to the counterfactual world of 2005. And account for all the depreciating gas plant, etc. So that's the rationale for the 60. Now, what we look at that is then is a projection of demand growth in the following decade after we stabilize the grid. And if we look at and what the assumption I brought to the table with the team was that will be on the upper band of demand growth, simply because, as with most cases, when there's suddenly a liberalization on restrictions of an input, you tend to have a massive surge in demand for it. So on an annualized basis, we're predicting around 4% per annum demand growth for the following decade. Tied to roughly as well 15 gigawatts or so of derated renewable capacity having to come offline because it's reached end of life. So that brings us to 40 gigawatts of capacity needed, in which we have a bit of more time to play with to get online, which makes it an ideal use case to really redeploy nuclear at scale. Um, I mean, I'm sure. I think nuclear is just it. On every mathematical and actuarial basis, it's just the best. It's the best form of power we have available on an energy density level. I mean, you know, while we're in the order of a couple of hundred kilowatt hours per kilo for hydrocarbons, uranium hits in the order of millions. It's very difficult and downstream of that is just so much more. It is ultimately, once you achieve the economies of scale and production, so much more greater affordability and efficiency. Um, we calculated, for example, that in terms of a fuel input, to fuel 40 gigawatts of nuclear plants, you just need to pay in terms of raw uranium imports for processing domestically, it only would cost $80 million, in contrast to the well over the hundreds of billions that we currently pay in natural gas imports for an equivalent amount. So it's on a cost basis, it ultimately makes sense. On a safety basis, I'm a great believer ultimately that it is that especially in especially the since the 1990s, I think we've solved many of the open questions that were dangling around with regards to nuclear scaling and deployment. So what we call for is 40 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity, um, built for by the state. And the reason why is for the interest is the reason why we particularly are strong on the state point for this new nuclear capacity is because the capital intensity of nuclear is so much higher. Whereas for a natural gas plant, around 20% or so maybe of the lifetime costs of capital and financing costs. For a nuclear power station is around 75%, which means that the sensitivity to cost of capital is so much higher, which means the government bond advantage enjoyed by state financing just makes sense. Which is why we also look at gigawatt scale nuclear plants rather than small modular reactors. So I like small modular reactors again as a concept for microgrids, but the main problem is that they are a solution to the capital intensity problem of nuclear. They attempt to basically reduce the capital costs so you could finance them more affordably in a privatized system. But if you've got large, very efficient gigawatt scale plants, like the one that we converged towards is the Westinghouse um, AP1000 system, um, the 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 capital advantage of state of state financing just make a lot more sense. So we project around we call for around 40 gigawatts of new AP 1000 reactors, which is around just short of they output around 1100 megawatts each. And sort of cover redundancy, that's 38 to 39 plants. Um, for the cost of the fleet, it'll be in a range of 100 to 140 billion, depending on the level of economies of scale Westinghouse have been able to achieve by that point. And depending on interest rate, that might be that's a lifetime cost of anywhere from um, of well that's an annualized cost of anywhere from 5.3 billion pounds per annum to 13.1 billion pounds per annum if financed through a tranche of 30-year government bonds.
Yeah, so I already am persuaded that the correct way to implement renewables is in a micro way. And I actually think that the reason that Britain has gone for these enormous wind farms, solar farms, is there's a collective action problem
Yeah.
for the consumer, and there's a bias to the big corporate lobbyists who are going to build these enormous farms, and therefore these corporate lobbyists, big corporate lobbyists, get to persuade the government that big solar wind farms are the way to go, and the government has so far ignored British government. This is unlike American state governments. The British government has ignored the subsidizing of renewables at the micro level, meaning at the domestic home level, where a domestic home could have a wind turbine, it could have solar panels on its roofs, it could have a government subsidized these heat pumps. The national government is subsidizing these enormous wind farms, which, as we've discussed, have all sorts of environmental and social costs and are not net efficient in carbon terms, and they are not net efficient in energy terms. So this is my bias. I don't think your micro alternative is in the paper. Why not?
Well, when it comes to renewables, they just, regardless of anything, even if we were to just go at the household level, at a solar panel and a little wind turbine on every roof, they still run into the intermittency problem. The intermittency problem is very hard to get away from because that's based upon issues that are that affect an entire regions or entire nations at once. That means that ultimately, that regardless of if that solar or that wind exists in a big farms or on rooftops, it's going to be constrained by those capacity factors in terms of the usage, which means that, and once that capacity factor usage gets into play, you basically need grid level storage to make it work, and grid level storage is extremely expensive.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, hang on. I mean, so I do have I accept what you're saying. There are still intermittency problems at the micro level as the macro, but you can store electricity at the micro level, with batteries. And I have experience of a home system. Home systems are very common in America. Admittedly, in the Southwest, where there is more reliable sunshine, and also there's a lot more wind. So this is not true. It is not cost effective in everywhere in the Southwest, but in most cases you can generate reliable energy from wind. Now there are problems in micro turbines. For instance, they also need some capital expense to install. And this is where the government can step in. Now, by the way, electrical batteries of sufficient capacity to make a home self-sufficiency, make a home self-sufficient. They're not they're no longer as expensive as they used to be. And I should mention a lot of the audience perceptions of how expensive micro solar and wind systems are driven by essentially companies offering these things at exorbitant prices, where they
Yes.
are taking advantage of the audience's ignorance of the true cost by saying, look, leave it all to us. We will install the whole system for you, and it'll cost you $50,000, right? So that's a typical estimate in the United States. If the homeowner does these things themselves, they can do it for a few $1,000s. Right, so there's just they can buy these technologies are available. They are off the shelf. You can buy them from Amazon. There is some technical skills that would be needed to put it all together. But say the government, the national government in Britain, steps in and provides those skills. Say it sponsors, it subsidizes installers to do that for the homeowner. So the homeowner can buy the materials and not have to pay for the installer to put it all together. Maybe the government could redirect its subsidies from the enormous wind and solar farms towards the materials themselves. Is that not an alternative to right in your plan? So this is the true competition in your plan. In your plan, you want to redirect those net zero climate change subsidies towards
Big centralized plan.
towards yeah, yes, you do, but that's going to benefit fossil fuels, right? In your grid stabilization phase. So why not redirect those subsidies to micro wind and solar?
The big problem is, I think, what the vision you outline actually it makes a lot of sense in Arizona, Nevada, and Texas, because ultimately the intermittency problem is such that the storage requirements are not that sufficiently high as to be too costly. But but the actual like storage requirements to make a system work and the surplus generation to do so is going to vary a lot based on geography. And so in the green paper we cite, to make and this is in the context of the 70 gigawatts of D-rate capacity nationally. We believe you would require, assuming that you've already got installed the wind and solar, to provide that capacity, and that's D-rated already, to really hedge against intermittency and provide a reliable level of stored energy via like continuously either direct from the power source or from a battery. You'd need around 210 gigawatts of additional D-rated generation and 2,500 gigawatt hours of storage capacity to meet 12 hours of national demand. Um, that's a lot. The latter one is really what gets you. And again, we're talking in the context of 70 gigawatts, so we'd have to do a bit of division to bring that down to 40 gigawatts of steady nuclear phase of what we call for our nuclear renaissance phase after the grid stabilization. But conservatively, 500 million pounds per gigawatt hour of energy storage. That's in line with at the high level, like that's at a decent level for a lot of cost competitive household level grid storage solutions. So that's 500 pounds per like roughly 500 pounds per kilowatt hour. But yeah, at a national level to provide the 2,500 gigawatts hours of storage needed, that's 1.25 trillion of storage required. Um, yeah, and for 70 gigawatts. So for 40 gigawatts, we're talking in the order of 800 odd billion, I'd guess, of energy storage requirements to make intermittent renewables work in Britain, in Britain's work for an extra 40 gigawatts of generation continuously. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
a,
but
it's a
let me check. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but let me check. What sort of storage you're talking about? Are you talking about a system that would need to store energy to put back into the grid to supply energy to people who are not getting, they're not self-sufficient on renewables?
yeah. The idea is by because I get I ultimately for a national rollout of renewables to really work, I believe ultimately I think the households are good. I think households are going to need to pipe their energy into the grid. It's ultimately it's that grid level provision of all micro generation sites that will be necessary to making sure that making sure the economics work out through a proper utilization of the equipment.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about that. So, I mean, the American system. So, I'll make this comparison with the American system. The American system is there are some people who are generating enough renewable energy that they're putting it back into the grid, and they are making money from the grid, right? And by the way, American grids tend to be local.
Yeah,
There isn't a national grid. Um, Now, having said that, some states have a sufficient capacity in their grid to supply other states, right? So a good example is California, which actually relies on neighboring states for energy during its greenouts. It's greenouts. So California is a great state to choose because it's very similar to Britain in policy and in take up of renewables, and it has the same problems. It has power outages, and it has very expensive energy because renewables are intermittent and the capacity just isn't there. And it also has an aging infrastructure, which means that
mm,
it has collapsed power lines that start wildfires, which isn't something the state likes to admit as as a consequence of its climate policies. But that's something we should be concerned about too. Now, in the American system, when people take up solar and wind at the micro level, they're essentially pursuing self-sufficiency. Most of them are pursuing self-sufficiency. They're not expecting to make money from it by
yeah.
supplying the grid. So can we not be can we not just lower our ambitions to that, where we redirect those subsidies to make more people self-sufficient from renewables? And by the way, I take your point. I take your point that Britain doesn't have the advantages of the American Southwest. However, there are plenty of other states in the north of
Mm,
America, like New Hampshire, where domestic energy producers rely more on wind. And I
yes.
think that's more of the model for Britain. So where Britons are not getting sun, maybe they can get wind energy, right? So could why not redirect? I'm kind of repeating my question,
No,
but
no, it's like a
I'm just clarifying my ambition.
yeah,
Why not redirect the subsidies that are currently going to renewables
yeah,
at a macro scale towards micro,
yeah.
just with the lower ambition that we make more people self-sufficient, that lowers demand on the grid as a whole, and you, an SDP government, you supply that demand to the grid as a whole with fossil fuels and nuclear.
That's a good. No, and thank you for clarifying. I think what you're hitting at is actually probably one of the higher level political disputes of the West. Inadvertently, it was the dispute between Jefferson and Hamilton, the dispute between the self-sufficient yeoman and the logic of specialization, urbanization, and scale. And this is and I think I think we're bound to have this argument again and again because ultimately the argument I invoke is a large centralized plant is, in terms of utilization rate and in terms of total return on capital and on capital is going to be higher than many, many individual small sites providing self-sufficiency because, ultimately, when if they have a local surplus, this self-sufficient local site, and their prime focus is providing for themselves. Well, that's like, that's energy that's not going to the grid level. Um, so, and so I think and so I think this argument between efficiency and self-sufficiency is probably it's probably one that's at the core of a lot of Western political back and forth. Um, and I would say this, and I would say that from a national perspective, my focus is on measures that maximize the energy return on investment from measures, and large
Yeah.
centralized plant is the way to go, is to do that. But I think I think I think one area I have as well as maybe it's uh, I'm a bit cynical as to whether how many households are willing to take up the challenge for self-sufficiency. I think it's admirable. I think it's actually a good moral quality to endeavor for such a thing. But I think, especially in a state such as Britain, I think which doesn't really have the the lingering um, cultural remnant of pioneership that I think that many American households might have.
That's a good
There is
point.
the there
Yeah.
is there is a bit there is a degree of there isn't really that in I quite I do I think many households will I don't think many households would take up that challenge as well in our
Yeah,
case.
that's a good point. But you can change that. I mean, you could persuade Britons of the merits of being energy self-sufficient, and there are so many directions that you can persuade them of that. There's an environmental direction. You appeal to the Greens by saying be self-sufficient, and then you are net neutral in your own home, right? Apart from actually the fossil fuels that make the materials in the home. But you're going forward, you are net neutral. So there's an environmental argument, there's an economic argument. You can save money by being self-sufficient in the long run. There's a capital cost, but maybe the government is going to subsidize that capital cost. So there's actually you're saving money from the beginning. Right, it's an economic argument. There's a moral argument, or let's say there's a conser- conservative political philosophical argument, as you've alluded to. Self-sufficiency is good for one's autonomy
Yeah,
as a political actor. There are lots of, and it would ameliorate some of the opposition you're going to get to this green paper, which is that you are throwing. I'm just
no, no,
sort of satirically exaggerating what the opposition is going to say. You are throwing out net zero and replacing it with fossil fuels. You are overreacting to the net zero problem by giving up on renewables and returning to emissions and pollution and all the rest of it. So, I mean, couldn't you ameliorate those criticisms by saying, look, we're going to invest in micro renewables?
you could do it. It's a question ultimately of trade-off, and the problem is micro renewables do fall prey to many of the fundamental challenges of intermittency that grid scale renewables do. They would require ultimately considerably a multiplicative cost to deploy compared to grid scale renewables. They've bridged the problems of utilization compared to inputs in grid scale. It's for me it's a matter of trade-offs, and the trade-off that I
Yeah,
have to have is creating is basically is creating an energy create I want I is creating an energy system that I can reliably know I can get online in good time, and also that basically is done as affordably as humanly possible. Um, Especially given the very difficult financial state of the country at the moment, and those are the constraints I'm operating under. I think if we I I've I allude to Jefferson because he's a great political idol of mine. Uh, and in many ways, but it's a case of I think the material conditions. But we often are, as in many cases, constrained by material conditions here. And for me, it's the micro. For me, as creating a state policy for an energy system, it's the financial and operational constraints sort of like nudge me towards gigawatt scale production.
yeah, yeah. I've pressed you enough on that, Matthew. Well
That's a good
said.
point.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think you you can maybe do both, right? I mean, you can fix the national grid, and you can take demand off it with micro renewables. All right, I've got a final question for you, Matthew. This is the final one, right? I would like you to clarify STB's position on nationalization. So it sounds like, and you clarify for me how you see it going forward, and you can speak for yourself rather than the party. But I can imagine the audience thinking, there's a lot of state intervention here. There's a lot of centralized planning. And the SDP does have a declared policy towards renationalizing a lot of industries. How much nationalization in the energy sector are we talking about? For right, all the power plants, the infrastructure, the actual the coal plants themselves? Can you
Yeah.
just clarify?
Our ambition, as set out in the Green Paper, is all of it. All the generation, all the transmission, all the distribution, and all the supplier and reselling companies. Um, the reason for this is that ultimately, and the vision that we have is to start out with in our plan, the new hydrocarbon and energy. plant will be constructed by a new state-owned body called Central Energy. Whole subcontract, people like Siemens for gas turbines, Westinghouse for the nuclear plants. Um, but by the time that this new 100 gigawatts of cumulative new capacity is constructed, we will then engage in a pretty aggressive rationalization of the energy system, buying out the transmission and supply infrastructure. Depending for most of the generation infrastructure, we can allow that to naturally age out through depreciation for the most part. Um, and but then and for more egregious cases, like a lot of the suppliers and resellers will basically say, we're not selling, we won't be selling our new central energy, won't be selling this generation capacity to you anymore, which will drive their price down to rock bottom and allow acquisitions on the with heavily significant discounts. And on transmission, compulsory purchase orders will be issued, so they'll be purchased outright, minus the odious debt that we consider that they took on through basically using debt, leveraging the historic price cap imbalances through debt take-ups. So it will be, it's extremely centralized, it's extremely command. Central Energy will become the single and categorical body involved in that takes up most domains with regards to generation, transmission infrastructure, and selling to the consumer. This is, I think, what is key is we're not doing this because we are, we're in a, we're of a purely optical or standalone political consideration. It's to achieve a very important end of ours, which is the introduction of a permanent nominal energy price fix at 10 pence per kilowatt hour, which by removing an open pricing mechanism for energy, and basically meaning that central energy can maintain this price fix for grid electricity, we can maintain this nominal price fix in perpetuity, which we believe is of great value to the broader economy, because we call the system the energy credit system because it establishes an identity between the valuation of the pound and the provision of reliable, stable energy. And it basically forces the state to engage in to elevate energy policy and the provision and long-term capital formation as a key pillar of economic policy that sits alongside fiscal policy and monetary policy, because ultimately inflation then becomes a proxy for demand. Like it becomes, a key means to project future demand on the energy system, because ultimately, that it becomes a means of of tracking the real price of energy in the next couple of years if we know the nominal price is going to remain fixed. And it's alongside fiscal policy too, and it allows a new degree of medium to long term continuity of expectations around energy pricing for investment by third parties. If you know that the nominal price is going to remain fixed indefinitely, then it's much easier for you to justify investment in an energy intensive enterprise. So it allows widespread reindustrialization. And it also finally by establishing this relationship between energy and value, it shifts the economic framing of activity into productive terms, because it allows us to frame a lot of the value of what economic activity is in terms of the amount of energy of either the energy that it produces or the activity that it serves, the quanta of energy saved. And we believe that such a reframing of value is, in terms of energy, is probably a necessary next step for economic for the Western economic model, because ultimately we uh, we, we have yet to reckon, I think, until now, with the fact that grid electricity is now the third factor of production alongside capital and labor. And we need a way but the way that it's priced is very difficult for it to be treated as with the level of gravity that's required. So that energy credit system it's designed to do that, and it allows a variety of measures to be put into place to better mitigate against the excesses of a boom bust cycle, ensure continuous real growth over the long term, etc. So that's why we gravitate towards full system nationalization.
Okay, well argued, sir. And thank you, Matthew. So I very much enjoyed the paper. It's very empirical, which is something that's been missing from British politics for far too long. So I commend you for that. I very much enjoyed talking with you, and I hope we talk again.
Likewise, thank you for your time, Bruce. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.